Hello, everyone, and welcome to Philosophication with Ginger and the Beard. I'm Michael, and I have red hair.
And I'm Jason, and I have a beard.
So, to cover my ass, because I'm in the military, I got to start every episode by saying the views expressed in this show are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official policy or position of the Department of Defense, Department of the Navy, or the U.S. government.
So we decided to start this podcast. We were roommates in college. We talk about deep stuff all the time, and for the past, I don't know, year probably, we've just had this kind of almost like a weekly or a once every couple of weeks date where we call each other on the phone and talk about whatever topics we're interested in at the time.
It's just guy love.
Right. Just guy love between two guys.
Yeah.
So at some point, after we've had enough of these conversations, after some of them, we just, like, once we're done, we'd think, damn it, why didn't we record that? I wish we had that on a recording. So we decided to just start recording them. So that's where we got the idea, and we're gonna roll with it. You got anything to add?
Yeah, I think, so I have my own podcast, the Unalienable Podcast, where I talk about the Constitution, and I'm thinking, I want to kind of stray a little bit from that, but keep it pretty political and ideological but I think I like the idea of doing this show as a much more open conversation where it goes wherever it goes. It doesn't always have to be about politics. It could be, anything. We could talk about Star Wars. We could talk about whatever, but though it will certainly be about politics sometimes. And we're just going to take the conversations we always have, every week or two, where we just think of something like, hey, that's something pops in my head. I want to talk about, honor, or I want to talk about the Avengers, or I want to talk about whatever. And then we just put it in this podcast. So this one is much more open-ended. It's called philosophication because it's not a real word, but the idea is that whatever we're talking about, we're just trying to talk about deep stuff that's, less superficial than just the weather or the game last night.
So what you're hearing when you listen to this podcast is basically what we always do when we talk to each other.
Right.
It's more or less just, we always have these conversations, and we're just recording them now. So I am a strongman competitor. I had a competition yesterday, Alabama's Strongest Man. It's the third one that I've competed in. I won the title last year in the middleweight division. And so this year I was coming back to defend the title, and I didn't. I was unsuccessful in doing that. I was beaten by another muscular ginger that I know. Sorry, you're not the only one. You're not the only big ginger in my life.
Yeah, I'm not that big.
So this guy's a monster. He's on the verge of getting his pro card, and he also has a great beard, like a way better beard than mine. And one day I'll have a beard like his, and then I'll be strong too.
Nice.
But yeah, so he pretty much destroyed everyone, and I destroyed everyone else. And so I took second place. So, I could have had a better day, but it was going to be a long shot to beat that guy. And I knew that going in. But, it is what it is.
Yeah.
I'll be back next year to take the title back.
Nice. And how long have you been doing strongman?
Well, this competition 2 years ago was the first one that I ever did. So
all right.
Right at 2 years. I think it's a week earlier this year than it was then. So, 2 years.
And that was back when you didn't have a beard because you were still in the Navy, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Not when I started. And I'm stronger now. So clearly the beard makes me stronger. And as it grows longer, it'll lend me more strength.
Yeah, it's like Samson, but with the beard.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, one day when I get out of the Navy, like you, I'll grow a beard like every sailor who ever got out of the Navy. I'll grow a big long beard for at least a year or two, and then my wife will make me shave it off probably if I can make it that long.
You just got to commit and tell your wife you're doing it anyway.
Yeah, well, we'll see how that goes. Anyway, so I just got back from debt from a detachment a couple weeks ago, and before that I was on my honeymoon, and before that just kind of getting ready for my wedding. So it's been a good 6 weeks since I really worked out regularly, and so I'm just getting back into it. I just hired the same coach back. I mean, I basically put her on hold because I knew I was going to have a couple months in a row where I wasn't going to be able to lift or eat the way I wanted to because of missions that were coming and then my wedding. So anyway, I'm getting back into it now. I just started a new program, starting with 5 days a week training, but that's really just because she's worried about me hurting myself, getting back into it. So I think it'll be 6 days again pretty soon. And I'm eating 6 meals a day. And we decided, because I have another mission coming up later this year, and I have plenty of cutting left to do, even though, I lost a good 20 something pounds before all this happened. There's not really time between now and that mission to compete. And then after that mission, there's pretty much one more competition and then it's over for the year. So I'm pretty much looking at competing next year, which is later than I wanted, but duty calls sometimes and kind of interrupts my program. But anyway, so the good news is I'm bulking again. So I'm still going to be losing body fat. That's the goal.
Hashtag bulking season.
Right. But it's not a hardcore bulk. It's a very long, gradual bulk. So I'm still trying to grow, trying to gain muscle, but I'm also trying to lose fat at the same time. So, so I'm back to getting a cheat meal every week, and then I get a cheat meal plus Chipotle every week. So nice. It's like 2 different times I get to eat something awesome. And it's this new program. Legs is twice a week, but one day is totally focused on like quads, and the other day is totally focused on hamstrings and kind of lower back, and then do calves on both days. So it's more thorough on each body part, and I'm doing it twice a week. But yeah, I'm not looking forward to that part. I do hate leg day. I'll say that. I'm a huge guy who hates leg day. It's every leg day is the new worst day of my life. But anyway,
just never become a strongman athlete, because then every day is leg day, and you have to learn to love leg day, or you just won't last at all. Yeah.
I'll never be a strong man for a lot of reasons. One, I can't grow a beard right now because I'm in the Navy. Two, I'm not very strong. I just, it's all looks. It's all for show. Just show muscles. I don't care about being strong. Everyone thinks I'm strong. People look at me and they think I'm strong, but I'm deceptively weak. So I don't know if is that what you would call it? Deceptively weak or deceptively strong? I guess when someone's deceptively fast, it means they are fast, but you wouldn't think they were fast.
Well, so if someone is deceptively strong, that means you wouldn't tell they're strong by looking at them.
Right. Then I'm the opposite. I'm deceptively weak.
So you're deceptively weak.
Yeah, you couldn't tell I was weak by looking at me.
You just look like Captain America, but you don't actually. You're not actually a beast at all.
Right. I'm just Lieutenant America.
You're just.
Anyone who's not in the military and won't understand that, but lieutenant is lower than captain. So in any branch, Navy or the other ones. So.
Correct. Well, if Captain America was in the Navy, I mean, rank, he would be. I mean, if he had the same pay grade, he would be Lieutenant America.
Right. Yeah, but I'm a Lieutenant Junior grade anyway, so I still am less than Captain America.
Lieutenant Junior grade America.
Lieutenant Junior grade America. Exactly. All right.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about the hottest new topic in current events today, which is, of course, the atomic bombing of Japan at the end of World War II.
Yeah. It's fresh.
Yeah. I've been waiting all week to say that, by the way.
Yeah.
So anyway, we're going to dive really deep into this and talk about the ethics and the morality and all of that. So what gave me the idea for this, and the anniversary of these bombings was just last week. I think, if I remember right, Hiroshima was Monday and Nagasaki was Thursday.
Hiroshima was on August 6th and Nagasaki was on August 9th, 1945.
Right. So yeah, Monday and Thursday. So yeah, that was a total coincidence. That's not what gave me the idea for this. I actually just watched Ken Burns' documentary about World War II. It's called The War.
Yeah, I got to see that because I saw Civil War and I loved it. My favorite documentary ever. So I want to see everything he's ever done.
I just started that one, actually.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a great documentary, and he also has one about the Vietnam War, which is great too, which I've seen. But yeah, so I watched that recently, and he towards the end he gets into the atomic bombing and what happened, and that's what gave me the idea for this. It's like, maybe we can talk about that. That would be a really interesting discussion to have.
Yeah, and then it just so happened it was the week that the atomic bombs, the anniversary of the dropping of the bombs.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what gave me the idea. And then we decided to roll with it.
I think this is one of those issues that it's kind of charged, and it's coming from a place of patriotism that it's somehow, kind of disloyal to question, decisions that we've made militarily in the past, and people like that who haven't necessarily thought a lot about it, and I'm not saying if you think a lot about it, you won't think that it was the right thing to do, but I've met people on both sides of this issue who felt strongly one way or the other. And I personally have more of a nuanced view. To me, it's not that straightforward. There's no one factor that makes it absolutely okay or absolutely wrong. To me, it's a moral calculation, and it depends on what your values are and what moral argument you're making, right? So I've heard people. I remember when I was in high school, I had a high school coach, and I don't know, it came up. And he basically just had his view was very straightforward. Just they never would have surrendered. We had to do it. We had no choice. And and what you hear all the time is people talk about the number of people that died or that would have died, the counterfactual proposal of what it would have taken. And but then on the other side, there are people who believe just the act on its face is so evil that it doesn't matter what kind of statistics you can pull out the other side and to justify it, that it doesn't quite justify it. And, I kind of find myself sympathetic to both views. And so I don't know. I don't even know exactly where I stand on it.
Yeah. So I used to have the same view as your football coach, where I thought, this was absolutely the right thing to do. And it wasn't a good thing that it happened. It was a necessary evil. And then we've talked about this before while we were in school, and you kind of changed my mind on it, and brought me to the other side for a bit. And now I'm kind of, I don't necessarily have my mind made up. I have a nuanced perspective on it also. I don't think it's black and white, and I think there's a lot of different angles to consider, which we'll go into. Basically, I think both of those extremes have it wrong. I think there's just too many factors to consider.
Right. Yeah. And what I think it can be argued either way. And you can come out wherever you may in the discussion. But what I think is the worst thing that somebody can do is to just completely ignore the downside of the alternative. Right. So right. I have more the people I grew up surrounded by would fall on the side of that issue where they think it was a good thing or the right thing to do was to drop the bombs. So, but like, to have that perspective and to have thought through it, there's nothing wrong with that, as long as you've critically thought about it and come to that conclusion honestly. But the worst thing that some people do, and I have experienced people like this, is to just completely disregard the negative side of that, to just pretend that there's nothing, that there was nothing wrong with it, that there was no moral question about what had to be done, that it was absolutely correct, right? I mean, to me, again, it seems like a balancing act, right? We have certain values on this side, certain values on this side, and it was a balancing act, and it tipped just far enough one direction that we decided to do it. I mean, I would like to give the benefit of the doubt to our leaders at the time that that's what happened, but to me personally, when I'm doing it, and what I think honest people, when they're doing it, they'll, whatever side they fall on, they can acknowledge, the downside, the negative. But when you just feel it was the absolute righteous thing to do, and we have no moral culpability as a nation, or our president at the time, or whoever made those decisions, they should just sleep like a baby, that there should be no moral question. I think that's the mistake, that I do think a lot of people feel that way, but I think they feel that way because they just don't bother thinking through it.
That's why I thought this would be a good thing to talk about, because we can, like we already said, I don't think either of us have those hardline views about it. And I think we can talk about those different factors and talk about the upside and the downside of doing it or not doing it.
Right. So why don't we start with like the most obvious reasons why people think it was justified? Pretty much the utilitarian side.
Okay. So yeah, I think that's probably, I mean, I can't think of, off the top of my head, I can't really think of another justification other than utilitarian one. Like basically the argument is that if we were gonna have to invade Japan to end the war, that was probably going to cost millions of lives, at least hundreds of thousands of lives. American soldiers and also Japanese soldiers and civilians. There's lots of reasons for that. The Japanese were a very different enemy than the Germans. They were fanatical, like through the whole war in the Pacific. The Japanese soldiers would hardly ever surrender. Like the number of prisoners taken in the Pacific War was just a ridiculously lower percentage than in the European War. And that has a lot to do with Japanese culture and the way their army operated. But, it was a factor. And that's probably the main factor that indicated just how horrible an invasion of Japan was going to be.
Right, just how costly.
Right, both for American soldiers and for the entire Japanese population. So I think the main argument in favor of doing it was that if we don't do this, we're going to have to invade Japan, and that's going to end up being way worse in the long run.
So yeah, I think the main argument for why it was the right thing to do is a utilitarian argument. And for those that don't know, utilitarianism, this isn't the strict definition of it, but generally speaking, utilitarianism is a moral philosophy where you give the most moral weight to whatever outcome produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people. The greatest good for the greatest number is the simplest way to put it. And people can argue the specifics of what good is and whether that's flourishing or whether it's, hedonistic pleasure, whatever. That the specifics of that can be argued within utilitarianism. But when an argument is a utilitarian one, it's an argument about numbers. So a classic example is the trolley problem, which I've mentioned before on my own podcast, but it's basically you have a trolley flying down a railroad track, and on the track you have 10 people tied up, and next to you is a lever that can, if you pull the lever, it'll divert the trolley onto a different track. But on that track, there's one person who is tied up. So you can either do nothing and 10 people die, or you can pull the lever and one person dies. So what do you do? So the straightforward utilitarian answer is you pull the lever, because 10 people dying is worse than one person dying. All right, welcome back. You may notice that we're wearing different shirts now. That's because it's a different day. And, which actually I want to talk about this. It's a pretty awesome shirt. Don't give up the ship. This is a Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry's battle flag from the War of 1812. So I just got this in the mail, and I'm pretty happy about it. It's also got the First Navy Jack over here. Don't tread on me. But anyway, that's beside the point. But I do want to point out that this will probably happen a few times, or maybe all the time. If you tune in often enough, you'll see the shirts just randomly change in the middle of an episode. That's because we both have full-time jobs. Sometimes we can't get a full conversation in the time that we have in a specific evening. So wardrobe changes are going to be just baked into the cake for this podcast. Well, as we were talking about
audio platform, it doesn't even matter because you can't see us.
Yeah. In fact, if you're listening on an audio platform, pretend I didn't say any of this. So anyway, where we left off before, we were talking about the utilitarian argument, and we were laying out what that utilitarian argument is in terms of numbers. So where we left off was the justification for the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki basically takes into account a couple different things. First of all, the number of people that did die from the bombings, and then the number of people that we think would have died if we had invaded the mainland of Japan. So just pulling out some numbers here for the sake of making the utilitarian argument. Basically, the real mortality rate of the atomic bombs will never be known. It can only be estimated. Basically, the overwhelming chaos made it pretty much impossible to count. But some more conservative estimates say that 150,000 people were killed in Hiroshima and 75,000 in Nagasaki. So we're looking at 225,000 people, and some estimates are lower, some are higher, but that's a pretty solid number according to a few different sources I found. There's one CNN article that talked about it on the 70th anniversary, and it said that 80,000 people died instantly in Hiroshima, and then Nagasaki. It says 70,000 killed instantly, but then that other estimate was 75,000 total. So again, it's hard to say, but let's go with 225,000 for the sake of argument. So that's the reality of what happened. 225,000 people died, all Japanese, mostly civilians. So the other side of the utilitarian scale is how many people would have died had we invaded Japan in a conventional invasion operation. So now this is another one that is so different depending on what you're looking at and who you ask. It was called Operation Downfall. That was what they called this planned invasion of the mainland of Japan. So it really depends. But what people like to use in the arguments, they use millions. So the most scary estimate that I found when looking at these was it was a study done by the Secretary of War Henry Stimson's staff by William Shockley, and estimating that invading Japan would cost 1.7 to 4 million American casualties, including 400,000 to 800,000 fatalities and 5 to 10 million Japanese fatalities. The key assumption was large-scale participation by civilians in the defense of Japan. Now, those are horrifying numbers, but I do want to point out that was just one estimate, and many, many other estimates were done that were far lower than that, including estimates from five-star admirals and generals, people who had been in combat with the Japanese already, and, depends on how much credit you give to each of these, but just for a few other ideas, in May of 1945, Admiral Nimitz, he's a fleet admiral, five-star admiral, estimated that 49,000 U.S. casualties would occur in the first 30 days. And so, again, the whole operation was supposed to be 120 days. So, triple that is the easiest way to do that. So 150,000. And then a study done by General MacArthur's staff in June estimated 23,000 U.S. casualties in the first 30 days and 125,000 after 120 days. The U.S. 6th Army was the unit that was actually tasked with carrying out the major fighting in this operation, and they estimated 400,000 casualties in the 120 days it would take to complete the operation. So the point is, it's a counterfactual, and we don't know, but you get very different numbers depending on who you ask. And all of these people I just mentioned, if you don't know who they are, then you don't have a good grasp on the war in the Pacific in general and, U.S. military history. But Admiral Nimitz, General MacArthur, these guys were experts, and so was their staff. So their estimates mean something, but you get very different numbers, as you can see. So it's hard to pinpoint. It's not so obvious when you say, oh, 1 million people would have died or 2 million people would have died. Maybe that's one of the many estimates, but again, we're dealing in counterfactuals. It's hard to say. But one point I want to make before I move on is even Truman himself kind of changed his tune on this. So Truman obviously had the most at stake in defending dropping of the bomb, since it was his decision. So as an example, he stated in 1953 that he'd been advised that U.S. casualties could range from 250,000 to 1 million combatants. But the numbers come from a meeting from June 18th of 1945, where the Joint War Plans Committee estimated 250,000 casualties. It says a review of the documents from Truman's library, from the Truman Library, shows that Truman's initial draft in response to that says that 250,000 would be a minimum. And the as much as 1 million phrase was added to the final draft by Truman's staff. So that didn't actually come from the Joint War Plans Committee. That was something added after the fact, arguably to make it sound better and more justified. And then another Joint War Plans Committee from June 15th of 1945, which provided planning information to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, estimated an invasion of Japan would result in 40,000 U.S. dead and 150,000 wounded. So that's 190,000. And that was delivered on June 15th. Both Generals George C. Marshall and Douglas MacArthur signed documents agreeing with the Joint War Plans Committee estimate. So you got General Marshall, General MacArthur saying 190,000 to 250,000. And then again, Admiral Nimitz saying 49,000 in the first 30 days, maybe 150,000 in the 120 days. So the actual experts on the ground seem to have estimated much lower numbers than what Truman was saying later. So it is what it is. It's a counterfactual. We'll never know, but it's not as straightforward as people like to say.
So the point here is there's widely varying estimates of how many people would have died in an invasion, how many casualties there would have been. And it's probably worth keeping in mind when we're talking about estimates is there's just so many factors that would have gone into what the death toll ended up being. Like you said, we can't know for sure. It's a counterfactual. But when you're talking about estimates, each person who's making the estimates, it's worth asking what their vested interest was, like what their point of view was. If you're like Truman and you just made this decision and you have to justify it after the fact, the estimates are probably going to be higher. Somebody who didn't want to drop the bomb, who thought it was the wrong decision and made an estimate, maybe their estimate would have been lower. But that's worth asking. I don't know necessarily all of those high-level military commanders. I don't know what their position was on dropping the bomb or not, but it's worth asking. The point here with all these numbers is that there's a utilitarian case to be made that dropping this bomb was the correct decision. Fewer people ended up dying with the bomb than if we had invaded Japan. So there's an interesting thing to consider here, which makes the point compellingly that utilitarianism is not the only consideration we need to make. And think for a second about this. What were the numbers that you had for how many people died in the bombings?
225,000.
Okay, so let's take that number for the sake of argument. Let's do a thought experiment here. How would people have felt about it if the question was not drop an atomic bomb on 2 cities and kill 225,000 people. What if the question was, what if we somehow had the capability to go into these cities with an army and kill the same number of people with guns and edged weapons and end the war that way? Let's say the result is the same. Let's say doing this ends the war, not doing it doesn't end the war. And, more people end up dying later because the war is going on longer. I think that no one would be okay with that. Or at least maybe a few people would be okay with it, but it would be a lot fewer people would be okay with it. So if the result is the same number of dead, same number of deaths prevented, but the method is way different. The method is, instead of dropping 2 bombs on 2 cities, we're going to go in here and kill the same number of people by hand. No one would be okay with that. And it's interesting to ask why. Because from a utilitarian standpoint, those 2 things are completely equivalent. If the amount of suffering and the amount of suffering prevented is the same, then those 2 things are equivalent. But no one feels that way. No one feels like those things are equivalent. So why is that?
I mean, it's a good question. The only thing I can think of is just how personal that act is and how impersonal it is to drop a bomb from miles away. And that's only the pilot. I mean, the rest of the Army and Navy and, Marines and the entire military chain of command gets to be hands off about it. And
right. So why is it that we feel better about it when it's a hands off way of accomplishing it?
yeah, I mean, I don't know the answer, but I guess, the same thing applies to anytime we drop bombs or, shoot tomahawks over the horizon. What do you think of like drone pilots and whatnot? And they'll be, thousands of miles away from their targets. They're just playing a video game in a container somewhere and killing people. I mean, not only is a drone really far away, but they're really far away from the drone. It's like the farther away you are from the violence, the less personal it feels. Though I know there's still issues with those people with PTSD and guilt and all that, but there's
Right.
clearly a difference in our minds. The proximity to the violence seems to make a difference. And I don't really know why.
Right. So it's probably also worth asking, how did we get to this point in the first place? Like, how did we get to the point where the question of whether to drop an atomic bomb on a city is even being seriously considered in the first place? And if we're going to go down this road, you can't talk about the atomic bombings without also talking about strategic bombing in general, which have been at this point going on for the whole war pretty much. And Dan Carlin has a hardcore history episode all about this, which kind of traces this back. And what it came down to was it started for utilitarian reasons, at least in large part. And this is because in World War I, when air power started to become a big thing in war, for the first time, you had on the front lines a reliable meat grinder of war. And you could reliably predict how many people are going to die this month, this year, for the next 2 years if this war keeps going on at the same rate. So during World War I, both sides were trying to come up with anything they could think of to end the war faster. And from a utilitarian standpoint, if you can reliably say that this many people are going to die if this war goes on for another 6 months, anything you can do to shorten that war is morally justifiable from a utilitarian standpoint. But like we just said, that's not the only thing to consider. But I'm just trying to illustrate how we got here. So strategic bombing became a thing in World War I, and then became a much bigger thing in World War II. And up to this point in the war, Japan and Germany had both been bombed into oblivion with conventional bombs. And I found the numbers for, just as one example, there's an estimated 100,000 people that died in Tokyo as a result of fire bombings for the last 9 months or so of the war. I bring this up not to make the atomic bombing sound any less terrible, because it doesn't make it any less horrifying. But it's worth talking about just for the sake of, why was this even a thing that was being considered in the first place?
So everything we talked about so far was really about whether or not it was better to invade or better to drop the bombs, and which one was the more morally defensible thing to do. But what we've been assuming is that those are the only two options. So what we're really getting at here is two things. First of all, did we drop the bombs to prevent the invasion? That's the dichotomy we're given, that it was the bombs or the invasion. So is that even true? And then the other question is, did dropping the bombs actually end the war? Or did it end for some other reason? Or would they have surrendered soon anyway, even if we hadn't dropped it? Now, I saw this first on some Netflix documentary, but I didn't know how reputable it was. But I found it in a few different places now, and like everything else, it's up for debate, how legit this is or whatever. But now I found a lot of this information in a Washington Post article from 1985. Wow. So some people believe, and documents have come out that strengthen the theory that other considerations besides preventing the invasion are the actual reason, or at least partially the reason, why the atomic bombs were deployed. The main consideration was as an act of diplomacy towards the Soviet Union, basically to let them know that we had it and to show them what we could do in the new balance of power once the war was over. So I've seen some different critics of dropping the bomb have said that it was Truman's demand for an unconditional surrender that was the reason they hadn't surrendered yet. Now, there's a lot of speculation out there, and a lot of leaders at the time thought that Japan was about to surrender, and that the only thing holding them back was the unconditional nature of the surrender. So according to this Washington Post article, the American and British combined chiefs of staff made public in 1976 the intelligence that they had in 1945 by the midsummer, which basically indicated that Japan was in a very bad way. And it said, quote, "The increasing effects of sea blockade and cumulative devastation wrought by strategic bombing has already rendered millions homeless and has destroyed from 25% to 50% of the built-up area of Japan's most important cities. A conditional surrender might be offered by them at any time." And then in July of that year, Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal's diary described the latest telegrams as, quote, "real evidence of Japanese desire to get out of the war," end quote. Forrestal was referring to a message from the Japanese Minister of Foreign Affairs that he sent to his ambassador in Moscow, where he told the envoy to lay before Stalin and Truman, quote, "the Emperor's strong desire to secure a termination of the war," end quote. Forrestal noted that this Japanese Minister of Foreign Affairs said further that the unconditional surrender terms of the Allies was about the only thing in the way. So above all, the Japanese didn't surrender because they couldn't surrender. Because it was unconditional, they couldn't know that their emperor would survive it. And to the Japanese people, in their religion, their emperor was their god. So they were worried not only about losing him as their emperor, but having him killed. So again, according to Forrestal, that's about the only thing they would have needed a concession to surrender. Another source discovered not too long ago was dated to May 12th of that year, where William Donovan, the director of the Office of Strategic Services, suggested that a slight change in the surrender formula seemed the only remaining issue. He said, quote, "one of the few provisions would be the retention of the emperor," end quote. So the claims that the Japanese absolutely wouldn't surrender no matter what, they'd fight to the last man, seems kind of unfounded based on this, that they were actually trying to lay out terms, to try and make it known that they were willing to talk. But Truman said absolutely no conditions. It seems at least arguable, according to a lot of these sources, that was as much a reason for why they wouldn't give up. So again, another and maybe the most important question is, was dropping the bombs actually necessary to end the war? And I've seen on a few different sources, and a lot of them were less reputable, or I'd never heard of them, that 6 out of 7 of the 5-star generals and admirals criticized the dropping of the bombs. I have a few of these quotes, and they weren't all from the most reputable sources, but I do have this Washington Post article, the same one I was just talking about. First of all, 5-star Admiral Leahy was very critical of dropping the bomb. He said, quote, "At the present time, a surrender of Japan can be arranged with terms that can be accepted by Japan and that will make fully satisfactory provisions for America's defense against future trans-Pacific aggression." Afterwards, Leahy reflected that, quote, "the use of this barbarous weapon at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender," end quote. Moreover, Leahy continued, quote, "In being the first to use it, we had adopted an ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages. I was not taught to make war in that fashion, and wars cannot be won by destroying women and children," end quote. President Eisenhower, who was a 5-star during the war, recalled in 1963 that he opposed using the atomic bomb on Japan during a July 1945 meeting with Secretary of War Henry Stimson. He said, quote, "I told him I was against it on 2 counts. First, the Japanese were ready to surrender and it wasn't necessary to hit them with that awful thing. Second, I hated to see our country be the first to use such a weapon," end quote. Fleet Admiral Bull Halsey said, quote, "The first atomic bomb was an unnecessary experiment," end quote. The Japanese, he noted, had, quote, "put out a lot of peace feelers through Russia long before," end quote. And then 5-star Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, he argued that a naval blockade would secure unconditional surrender without an invasion. A top Army Air Force commander, General H.H. Arnold, said unconditional surrender could be won by October. So the point is, it's not even clear that dropping the bombs was necessary to end the war. It seems that 6 out of 7 of the 5-star admirals and generals criticized the dropping of the bombs. Now, a lot of that was for reasons of honor and just war, and some of it was for strategic reasons that it wasn't necessary. At the very least, it's questionable whether it was necessary.
So yeah, I guess the point of all of this is that we're calling into question the idea that the bombs were necessary to end the war, and we're asking the question of maybe if conditions had been allowed on the surrender, if Truman hadn't demanded unconditional surrender, then maybe Japan would have surrendered long before they did. So this brings up just war theory, and just war theory has two facets to it. One is jus ad bellum, which basically talks about justification for going to war in the first place. So in order for a war to be a just war, it has to be undertaken for just reasons. So World War II against Japan, we were attacked. So reasons for going to war, that's covered. The other facet of just war theory is called jus in bello, which means just conduct during the war. So this makes the case that even if your reasons for going to war are just, in order for that war to remain just, your conduct during the war has to stay justifiable. So if a nation is attacked and goes to war for just reasons, in order for the war to still be just, that nation can't just go into the country that attacked them and kill everyone, right? Because that would not be just conduct in war. So we're concerned with the second one because the reasons for going to war were just, but we're questioning jus in bello here. So was demanding unconditional surrender not abiding by that principle? So if the war could have been ended by allowing conditions on the surrender before the bombs were dropped, is that just conduct? Is demanding unconditional surrender just conduct in war?
Right. And not just demanding the unconditional surrender. I mean, that is one thing. That's one question. Is that just conduct? And then there's obviously the dropping of the bomb itself. Is that right? Just conduct? I really think it goes into that quote I just talked about from Admiral Leahy, where he said, "I was not taught to make war in this fashion, and wars cannot be won by destroying women and children." That's coming from jus in bello, the conduct during war. Now, Admiral Leahy, not to toot my own horn and your horn, he went to the United States Naval Academy. He was taught from then, and then his upbringing throughout his career, how to fight wars in an honorable fashion, in a just fashion. And this went against everything he had been taught. And I really think that part of the quote just demonstrates the point here, which is that regardless of whether or not you think it was justified, it was awful. It was barbaric. And that's the takeaway that like everybody should have. There's conduct in war that is, morally defensible, and there's conduct in war that isn't. We usually call the stuff that isn't war crime, and stuff that is just the conduct of war, right?
Right.
There's something about the deliberate targeting of civilian cities for the sake of ending a war that it's not just a calculation of number of dead, right? There's more to it than that. And the act itself is inherently wrong to attack civilians in any way, even if it wasn't, whether it's fire bombs or whether it's an atomic bomb or whether it's a rifle. We don't attack civilians on purpose, right? It's called collateral damage. We expect some of it. We expect some civilians to fight back, in which case they're not really even civilians at that point. They're combatants, right? There's something reprehensible about targeting civilians. That's not new. That's always been the case. And that's why there's more at stake than just the utilitarian numbers. And, this is just one of many sort of arguments against it is we have our national honor to consider. We have standards, we're better than that. And so I'm not saying that is the knockout blow that makes it not okay, but I'm saying it's not as straightforward as utilitarian number of deaths in one circumstance versus number of deaths in another. It can't be that straightforward because the act that we're talking about is inherently on its face evil and awful.
So if you're going to do something that is reprehensible on its face in war, which this is a question of war, right? Which is people killing people. Like it's never going to be a completely okay thing. But there are undoubtedly some actions that are way worse than what's considered normal conduct in war. So killing civilians. I think this is what it comes down to, is that if you're going to violate that principle of jus ad bello or jus in bello and do something that's reprehensible on its face beyond what's considered normal in war, there better be a damn good reason for it. This goes back to the idea of acknowledging the downside of your own position.
Right.
So we talked about this earlier, but it's not a question of, is this act good or bad? It's a question of, this act is definitely bad, but is it justified?
Right. And as straightforward as that sounds, I don't think a lot of people are even willing to say that this act is inherently on its face bad. But is it justified? Yes. Like, people, in justifying it, you get these very, very hardcore one side or the other, and not a lot of nuance, not a lot of people that are willing to accept that there's any negative to their side or any positive to the other. It's really all I'm asking for, from any of the people I know or anybody out there.
Yeah, I don't expect that we're going to resolve this argument on a podcast, but
right.
If people take anything away from this, it's that wherever you land on this, acknowledge that there's downsides to your own position. Like, acknowledge that it's not just absolutely right. There's downsides to it. Right.
Yeah. And I think that really sums up this whole conversation. We can't necessarily convince the listener that it was unjustified or it was justified. A lot of that depends on estimates and counterfactuals that we can just never know how it would have turned out, right? But it's just the one thing that I hope people can take away is just to acknowledge how awful the act itself was. It's so obvious. If any other country had done this besides us, there's no way we would justify it to the same degree. And if any country had done it to us, it doesn't matter how good their reason was. We would never forgive them. Just think about that. Try to imagine Japan winning the war and invading the United States, and then deciding, well, should we invade the United States? They have, all these people, they're all armed. They have a history of fighting tyranny. They will not lay down. They will fight to the last man. I don't know. Maybe I'm overestimating us, but I think our history has shown that Americans are fighters too. Anybody deciding to invade our homeland would have similar considerations if they were trying to take over the United States. So why wouldn't they do the same calculation and drop atomic bombs on us until we surrendered? Right? Now, would we forgive them after the fact because we're fighters and because we're not going to lay down? Would we forgive them? There's no way in hell. And the most adamant person who feels that it was the right thing to do to drop the bombs would not forgive if the shoe was on the other foot.
There's one more thing I'd like to touch on before we finish up. We've talked about the hardline opinions on either side. And I think you have to, like, whether you think it was justified or not, you have to accept that it was horrible. And it was, the act itself was immoral. But it's interesting to think about maybe why some people won't accept that, because there are people who don't accept that. So I don't know. Why do you think it is that we're talking about the hardliners on the side of this was definitely the right thing to do? Why do those people not accept that this was a horrible action? I don't know if it's correct to say that they don't accept that it was a bad thing at all.
Well, maybe, I'm sure there's some people that describes, but there's probably more people who just don't bother thinking through that. It's not that you can't get them there. If you walk them through it, they would, and they will, but they won't do it on their own. It's a simple calculation in their mind. It's one way or the other. So they pick one for good reason, sure, but they feel strong enough about it. They don't bother delving into the other side. I think that's probably more likely than I think that happens more often than people who really think through it and then still think it wasn't bad.
Yeah. And to kind of tie this into our political climate today, I think it probably has a lot to do with tribalism, with political tribalism. And that, if I'm a Republican, I have to think global warming is bullshit. I have to be pro-life. I have to like Donald Trump. I have to have all these opinions that Republicans have, and I can't waver from those in any way. The point is that I think political tribalism probably has a lot to do with it. And it's almost an identity thing. It's like my identity is that of a conservative, and the things that conservatives say have to be right. And wavering from that in any way is now unpatriotic, or I don't want to consider that there might be some opinions that my side has that are immoral.
Right? Yeah. I think patriotism was really the right word. Like, that's the takeaway to me. I don't think conservatives on the whole can't see that it was bad and then justify it still. I think on the whole, that's probably more common than anything else, if I had to guess, right? But
right.
So I still think it's uncommon, but it would certainly seem to me it would be conservative folks, a lot more right-leaning folks that would not think there was anything wrong with it, right? But I think you're exactly right. It's about political tribalism, and there are plenty of people who believe any sort of criticism against military action taken by the United States is on its face unpatriotic, and not just a criticism of the action taken, but a criticism of our country as a whole, or our military as a whole. Now,
fair, side note, to be fair, there are people who take it in that direction. On the other side are liberals who will say, this bombing was horrible, and it's just another example of how racist and horrible, and the U.S. was never great, and that kind of thing. So it happens both ways. So
you understand their defensiveness, but the problem is in self-reflection, and when you can't even bring yourself to say something and that you're patriotic, but you can't bring yourself to criticize. And this happens with the war in Iraq. It happens in Afghanistan, Vietnam. It's a big one. Even today, it's a very conservative thing to totally justify Vietnam and to think there was nothing wrong there, right? And I think most people, at the time it was certainly lefties that hated it, but I think most moderate people, at least some facets of the war, if not the purpose for going to war in the first place, they think wasn't so great, right? But to even criticize either the intentions of the leaders at the time or the conduct during the war is somehow unpatriotic and like a bash on the military. Now, it should go without saying that I'm not bashing the military when I'm critiquing specific, specific actions taken by the military. I am in the military. I'm very patriotic. I'm clearly not bashing the military. That's not my point here. But I don't know if it's social pressure by their friends or the way they've been indoctrinated, but people need to be able to have nuanced opinions. We're always given false dichotomies, and this is a perfect example. And I think it is pretty much only people presented that false dichotomy who would refuse to accept the obvious statement that dropping atomic bombs on people is wrong.
And that goes to the purpose of this podcast, really, which is we're two guys who are, non-experts, and we're sitting here trying to have a nuanced conversation about the topic. And you are in the Navy, I was in the Navy, we're both patriotic. We both have our biases and our opinions. We're sitting here trying to have this conversation and acknowledge the pros and cons of both sides, acknowledge the nuance, and avoid being forced into that false dichotomy of I either think this because I'm a conservative or I think this because I'm a liberal. I think we both would agree that that's probably the biggest problem with our politics today, or at least it's up there, is that nobody can have those opinions. No politicians can have nuanced opinions, for sure, because they just end up alienating their base, because if they say anything that's not completely in line with their own party. So we don't claim to be experts at this, but we're making an effort at it, right?
Yeah. So I don't know. I feel like I kind of started this conversation, and I've thought about this a lot over the years. We've talked about it a lot over the years, right? But yeah. I think when I started this, I was, like always, kind of in the middle and kind of torn, but I've gone back and forth about exactly where I fall. And I think before I kind of fell on the side of yes, it was justified. I begrudgingly accept that it was justified and we should have, and that, the lesser of two evils. But now after this conversation, because again, this was kind of an organic conversation that, we were figuring stuff out as we went. I kind of feel I'm kind of empathizing with Admiral Leahy. It's like he's tugging at my heartstrings when he said that we adopted the ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages, and that wars can't be won by destroying women and children. Now, granted, he has a little more insight than the rest of us, and he did say before that we didn't actually need to drop the bomb. So if you feel that way, that it wasn't necessary, then there's no justification for dropping it, right? That's just gone.
Yeah, the only possible justification for this is the utilitarian one.
Right.
And if you don't accept that it was necessary to end the war, then that completely negates
right
the whole utilitarian perspective on it.
Right. So that is where Leahy was. But even without that, what he's talking about when he's talking about use in bello, he's talking about conduct during war. And he's a man of honor. He was raised up in an honorable tradition, and he was taught to make war in an honorable, just fashion. And so to him, it's not justifiable, right? So right. Even putting aside the fact that he didn't think it was necessary, that's clearly what bugged him the most about it, and what bothered him for the rest of his life. And again, these quotes from his memoirs. His biggest problem with it is that it was so evil that we just can't be that way. Like, there is no excuse. And, I don't think that makes me a hardliner, because, as we've gone through this whole thing, I think I've demonstrated a willingness to hear both sides, but that's kind of where I'm falling now. I think he's kind of pulled me the other direction, and I kind of think it was not the right thing to do, even if it was necessary, that it was like, even if it did end the war, that it still was just too barbaric?
So if I could sum up how my opinion has changed on this, where I am now, I'm not sure this conversation itself has changed my opinion much. I think I'm still pretty much undecided. It's obviously a hard decision to make, but if you make the assumption that the bombs are what ended the war, then the utilitarian argument is very compelling to me. But on the other side, the most compelling argument to me is the just war argument, the aspect of conducting oneself honorably in war. And I don't think we want to be the kind of nation that is okay with doing reprehensible things, even if that's what it takes to win. That's why I'm torn.
All right, Jason, I think we pretty much beat that one to death. I think that was good.
70-year-old dead horse.
Yes. Yeah. And we've totally solved it. So everyone who listened to this, you should totally go away with the exact correct answer now. Anyway, that's it for today's show. Thanks everybody for tuning in. So if you're watching on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button below. If you're listening on any of our other audio platforms, please make sure you subscribe, leave ratings or comments. It really helps algorithmically in getting the word out about our show. If you like the show, please share it with your friends on social media. Please like the Philosophication with Ginger and the Beard Facebook page. And please make sure you comment down below. We really want to engage you guys in free and open conversation. That's really the whole point of doing this. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.